Welcome to Co-op Radio 102.7 FM CFRO. My name is Reginald Angus Argue. You're listening to the Monday Brown Bagger. That song right there was done by a gentleman by the name of Jeremy Camp, and it's called This Man. And this program we're going to be doing today, we're going to be focusing on two churches that there's been tremendous scandals running through these churches. Not in any way is this meant as an attack against everyone within that church. Our guest is a retired bishop from the Mormon Church, and also he has family roots from the Mormon Church. My wife and I in the past have told people that we've been sealed within the Mormon temple. We are not active within the Mormon Church, but our guest wife is in good standing in the Mormon Church. Now, before I introduce our guest, I'd just like to remind our listening audience that this show is going to be archived on my website of reginaldangusargue.com. I'd also like to say that the word Canada originates from a Native American word meaning village, and I feel as a veteran of the Canadian military that it is my sworn oath to stand tall for all people within the village of Canada, as I feel in a real democracy the power rests in the hands of the people and only the people. I would now like to introduce our guest today, who is a retired aeronautic engineer, mineralogist, and runs a non-profit private investigation company, whose late father, Dr H Clyde Davis, was hired as in 1953 as the chief technician for the Atomic Energy Commission in the United States. With this said, I'd like to introduce Steve Davis.
Good day, Reg. How are you today, and the wonderful people there in Vancouver?
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to come on, Steve. And before we get to, how much resources are sitting in each region within Canada, there's an extremely important topic that this Co-op Radio has been covering for many years now, and it's been the residential schools. And I will say right now, if it wasn't for Co-op Radio, I feel that this subject right here wouldn't have had a chance to get out. And, with this subject, we know that over 50,000 children have been killed in the residential schools, Native American children. We know that tens of thousands of other children, Native American children, have been sexually, physically abused and tormented. We know that members of the Catholic Church have been involved, members of the United Church have been involved, and other churches, but there's been no mention of the Mormon Church. The first question I have, do you know anything about, any involvement that the Mormon Church may have with the residential schools here in Canada?
Well, the key element that the Canadians have been so connected to the United States Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or like you said, the Mormon Church, has been their Canadian leaders. And the key person who was connected into the residential school system was the Minister of Mines for the Canadian government was N. Eldon Tanner. And here he goes back to the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1960s. And by the 1960s, when he was absolutely a great leader for the Canadian operation, he gets called into Salt Lake City to basically become one of the great leaders down there in dealing with the connections of mind control between the United States religion and Canadian people to be tested. In other words, they like to use people as guinea pigs to see how they react to mind control activities.
And that Mr. Tanner was actually from the province of Alberta. And correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, wasn't he involved with the late Manning Sr.'s social credit government?
Well, yeah. N. Eldon Tanner, he was a semi-professional pitcher. And so he was really well recognized there as a pitcher there in the, like you say, in the Alberta area. So he was a sports person. And he was also a wonderful intellectual person who found out how to actually be able to manipulate people through false promises.
And there also, when I was doing my research last night after we had the conversation, I ran across, you pointed me towards doing some research on the Indian placement, which is a program set up by the Mormon Church, I think in the 40s, all the way to 1996, when it was finally closed down. And this program right here, what I'd like to know, how does this Indian placement, how does it involve not only the Mormon Church, but leads right up to tie into the federal Canadian government at the same time?
Well, the key person in the Indian program was Spencer W. Kimball, and he was a banker and insurance man down in southern Arizona, and his family had moved up from Juarez, which is a polygamous organization that everybody's been listening on the news now about all the the cartels of Mexico are attacking people through Juarez, Mexico, and whatever because of the corruption that's basically been through secrets of the Mormon CIA operators who would bring in drugs and stuff through their contacts through various communities along the United States-Mexican border. So the key person in the Indian placement program was Spencer Kimball. And like I say, in the 40s, he was a banker down in Safford, Arizona, in Graham County, and he was the stake president, a prominent leader there. And amazingly, how the story got involved with his involvement in the Indian placement program is there was a terrible weather that hit his county, and him being the baker, the insurance adjuster, and also the church leader, basically had a very bad dilemma in the area because of the weather in 1942 wiping out the whole community. He basically convinced his whole community, which is mostly Mormons, to settle on just a few pennies on the settlement with the insurance policies and all. That immediately brought him to the attention of Salt Lake City. And so in 1943, he's called to be an apostle there in Salt Lake City, and he brings up this wisdom of basically controlling people and manipulating people to the basically, trust me, I will never lead you astray. And so the Indian placement program was basically engineered mostly by Spencer Kimball. So when he passed away as president of the church, and he was president of the church from 1974 to 1985, so his replacement, Ezra Taft Benson, basically got up right when he became president of the church and says, hey, we're no longer going to work on the Lamanite program, the Native Americans. And so like you're saying, for the next 10 years or so, basically the Indian placement program was phased out because Spencer Kimball passed away.
And also, I just found in my notes, actually, it was from 1947 to 1996 for the listening audience when this program was in place. And with this program right here, we know that members of the United Church sold off land and other resources that belong to the Native American communities here in Canada and benefited from it. But how did the Mormon Church, let's say, benefit either financially or physically from the residential schools?
Well, they basically took their Indian placement program, which basically is set up during the school year. In other words, during the school year, they would place these Native American kids, the indigenous people from the various Indian tribes all over the United States and Canada and Mexico, and place them in very successful family organization structures in the Mormon Church. Well, they took that program and basically showed how during the school year they would do mind control tactics of these indigenous kids and basically trained them so when they went back for summer or for the 3 months between the school year, they would basically control their parents and their tribal leaders and tell them how wonderful it is to integrate and bring in this new knowledge and money and technology and stuff. So basically it was a systematic 9-month of brainwashing kids in organized family structure that basically was carried on into the United Church up there with the Indian placement program with the residential schools up there in Canada.
Yeah, because I've noticed through my research last night that it actually did talk about how some Native American children were forcibly confined to boarding schools, and I took the boarding schools, okay, that's residential schools here in Canada. And also I found that this program stretched up to Alaska at the same time. So, you know, what I feel, based on what I was reading, what you're telling me right now, Steve, to the people out there that you've watched a program called First Wave, I felt like this program here, Indian placement program, is nothing more than the programming of the foot soldiers and the coming wave of the Gual, and Gual being the New World Order or Illuminati, whatever you want to call it. And that's when all these few individuals are sitting in the background that have been assimilating the Native Americans and other people to their way of thinking and allowing the Gual to come in, step in, and grab everything for free. And there's no fight to stop it.
Well, this was the important thing of N. Eldon Tanner with Spencer Kimball back in the 70s and 80s, because the GAO, the General Accounting Office of the United States government, put up 27 satellites. And these 27 satellites are strategically placed to be orbiting around the Earth. And there at Utah State University, there in Logan, Utah, they have a laser beam. And they basically beam up a laser beam to any one of these satellites and basically create a hologram. So basically what was set up by NASA and by the United States government was a way to basically fulfill all of the traditions, the folklores, the the visions of olden days by the indigenous people or old scriptures or whatever, basically to have them fulfilled through holograms.
So we're talking about that 3 days of total darkness, where a day is like a nighttime. That could be with this hologram program that could have come into effect then.
Well, that was the key thing called the blue beam process, because what it is, it took a scripture in the Old Testament. It's Zechariah chapter 14, verses 6 and 7. Now, that is basically a scripture that was given, let's say, 500, 400 BC, and basically it was a description of the birth of Christ. So basically when it was a day, night, and a day, basically at the time of the birth of Christ. So what they wanted to do in this Blue Beam project right there in Logan, Utah, they wanted to recreate the day, night, and day. So they're going to illuminate through these gemstones in these satellites. Basically, they're going to light up the whole world, so it would last for a day, night, and a day.
That's amazing in itself. Getting back to the natural resources, I know that you and I were going to go from region to region and how much resources are in Canada at this time. We're talking a ballpark figure, estimate number. But before we touch on that, do you feel with the residential schools that let's say we know that the United Church benefited from this, right? But the main question is, do you feel that members of the Mormon Church may have, benefit of in the way that they may have been able to illegally acquire some of the natural resources from the Native Americans here in Canada?
Well, the key element in Canada is based upon, by law in Canada, it was provincially set up that the anything underneath the ground was the natural resources of the government. And it was local and federal and provincial, basically saying that, okay, you can build your house, you can build your building, you can build a factory, you can do whatever you can on the surface, but the government controls all the natural resources. So this was the key element of N. Eldon Tanner, the Minister of Mines there in Alberta, because the big thing of mining was there in Alberta. And I took many, many trips up there with my father, who basically was the geologist for the United States government, like you said, beginning back in 1953. My dad had 8 airplanes in Salt Lake City Airport in 1953 where he was to map out the whole United States for the mining activities. Well, this passed on down to Mexico, this passed on up into Canada and elsewhere, and the person in charge of it was my dad. And so for umpteen years, as we moved into Tucson, Arizona, and they're working at the University of Arizona with the organization very close to Mexico, because the key element in this is secrets. And so, like you're saying, they basically did a secret deal with the various Canadian operators, but also with the indigenous people. So they'd come in there, and the biggest element of getting people a lot lax back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s were alcohol, where they basically would get people drunk into a state that they basically would sign agreements, agree into things when they were basically giving these promises and opportunities and financial things strictly for the case of taking care of the natural resources.